Well, I think there's one more thing, one more trend that was interesting that showed up in the Wall Street Journal. And I think it's a good way to kind of sew this up, that as we're thinking about how to move forward over the next year or two, first, we're going to have to figure out how to organize that work, how to prioritize what work is going to happen, and honestly, how to build this into projects and put this into our IT portfolio, which leads to a challenge that has been endemic in the IT world for a while, how to support work management and project management. I know that on the SaaS management side, the category that sees the greatest explosion of solutions use is always project management. It is not uncommon to go into an enterprise and on doing an initial audit, finding that there's 15, 20, 25 project management solutions, often that look very similar. But when you start digging in, you see that part of the challenge here is that work management has changed and evolved a lot over the past, call it decade, 15 years, to require multiple solutions here.
Well, so it is absolutely, we could probably spend the entire show talking about this evolution in my mind, because it is so fascinating and near and dear to my heart on a couple levels. But like, you're using two terms almost interchangeably, and I think they represent this evolution, right? We have historically, the last probably more than 30, 50 years, talked about project management, right? Microsoft Project was like the big thing, that, Gantt charts and waterfall approaches and it was this big idea of big projects that we were managing, all these resources together. What I think is interesting, we're now talking about work management, and we sometimes use them synonymously, but work management is really sort of the opposite perspective. It's the idea that I personally, as an individual knowledge worker, am trying to manage my work in the context of these bigger projects. But the reality is, I'm not living and working on one project. I'm working on tens, maybe hundreds of projects, or I'm part of them, or maybe not even projects, maybe just workflows that I'm taking actions. And so we're seeing this really interesting evolution. So there's an entire category of companies that are doing work management now, people like Asana, Rike, Monday.com. Zoho just introduced a new thing called Tables, which I think that's what it's called, which is sort of a version of work management. Airtables is out there. There's all these, it's this growing area that of people leveraging tools to effectively create databases as a way to manage the flow of work for myself, or for an individual. And then there's an entire, other category of like personal knowledge management that like I use as a product called Capacities. And I literally, every single thing I do is in there. That's my work management tool that I'm using for all of these things. And it all flows together. And I think it is, what is really fascinating is two sides of this. One is, you're right, these are so personal. This article about from the Wall Street Journal was talking about how people get so personally invested in whatever they're using to manage their work that trying to rip it out of their hands is, a very challenging thing. But we're going to have to get better at managing work. It's a sort of an irony with all this talk about AI, where we're automating everything. The reality on the ground for the individual worker is things have become more complex. Things have been harder to figure out what you should be working on and how to prioritize and how to manage. So I think that we're going to see this space begin to explode and collide with the ServiceNows of the world and the Symphonies of the world that are really in the business of workflow orchestration and automation. And as those workflows are intersecting with the individual work management function, we're starting to see crossover, right? And so I think it's going to be really, really interesting to see how all these sort of worlds start to intersect and what sort of comes out at the other end, because I struggle with it every single day. And I think almost everyone who tries to manage their work is struggling with all these different tools you're using and how and when to use which one.
Yes. From an integration perspective, just think about recent earnings reports. ServiceNow keeps growing 20% a year and has been making big promises on their revenue. Obviously, the top-down definition of services and process and workflow management isn't going anywhere, and there's a huge demand for it. In Salesforce's most recent announcement, MuleSoft revenue was up something like 25% year over year. So obviously still a huge demand for application integration. And this is probably an area that is going to keep growing. Great news for the integration people. Your job isn't going anywhere. Your work is just going to get harder and harder with the proliferation of apps happening right now. But this also means that companies have to figure out what is our integration strategy right now as applications probably double again over the next 5 years. And as these work management capabilities are going nowhere, and we're going to see increasing automation. This means more to manage from a digital perspective, not less, and not just more, but significantly more, leading to an order of magnitude more over the next decade or so. That's the reality that we have to look at. We are not just looking at incremental growth as we did the last 3 to 5 years, where we had some cool automation going, but it was definitely manually manageable with the processes that we had in place. We are going to have to see this transformation of automation strategy over the next few years.
I agree. And I think you're absolutely right. I think that if I'm a CIO today, I need to be thinking about it across all of those dimensions. How am I doing that at a macro level across the enterprise? But also, how am I addressing that? How is that going to manifest on an individual level for my knowledge workers, for my employees? And how can I help them manage this complexity? Not only the complexity of all the different technologies they have to use to do their job, but the complexity of that workflow, of all these different workflows intersecting, and how they deal with and address that. And how can I leverage automation to help them solve some of that, but do it in a way that is not obtrusive, that I'm not saying you're not allowed to use that software, even if that works for you and makes you more efficient, you have to use this software, right? How do I allow all this to work and interact? And ironically enough, I think AI is going to help with a lot of that. It's going to, create this layer that helps create, an integration layer, not in the data integration way, but in a process integration, in the way I think integration that allows me to communicate and interact with others, even if we're using different tools, almost like the Star Trek Universal Translator for enterprise software, right? And I think that's what we're going to find out, is that I can go and query my Copilot to ask whatever I need to get information or to interact or perform an action that I need done, even if it's happening with somebody else who's using a different system, that becomes what, how I can interact. And I think that that's where this is going to land, because we're never, I was just talking to the same CEO. It's like, we're not going to go back to these days where, the cycles where we would rationalize everything back down into this nice, simple box. It's just not going to happen. So it's now instead, how do you figure out a way to make all of it work together cohesively?
Yes, and that is IT for 2024, 2025. That is what we're facing for the rest of the decade. Yes.
Yeah, exactly.